want to tell you about something that happened to me last week, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I was sitting in my apartment in that weird mid-afternoon light where you're not quite sure if it's 2 p.m. or 4 p.m. I was reading something, honestly, I can't remember what, and I suddenly felt reality catch up with me. Like, when you're driving on the highway and you zone out and then suddenly you snap back into focus and realize you've been on autopilot for the last 10 miles. It was like that, except it wasn't autopilot. It was like reality itself had been running on low detail, and the moment I looked up, the universe was frantically rendering everything into high resolution. The dust particles in the light beam got sharper. The color of my wall suddenly had texture. The hum of the refrigerator in the background went from ambient background noise to a presence I could almost touch. And I thought, what if that's not a trick of my mind? What if that's actually what's happening? Welcome back to the Existence Experiment. I'm your host, Travis R. Barlow. Last season, we asked the big why. Why does the simulation exist? Why is consciousness incubating inside this reality? Why do any of us exist at all? This season, we're zooming in. We're asking how. How does reality actually render? What are the rules of the rendering engine? And here's the uncomfortable part. Where are the seams? Today, we're talking about observation. Consciousness? The weird mechanics that might make you the most important person in the universe, at least from your perspective. This is the observer. Let me start with something weird that physicists have been arguing about for over a century, and they still don't have a good answer. In quantum mechanics, there's this thing called the measurement problem, and it's basically this. Reality acts completely different depending on whether anyone's looking at it. Before you think I'm being metaphorical, I'm not. I'm being weirdly literal. Imagine an electron. No, actually, that's too concrete. Imagine the possibility of an electron. Before you measure it, before you observe it, that electron isn't in one place. It's in a superposition. It's kind of everywhere at once, described by something called a wave function. It's like the electron is a ghost that occupies multiple states simultaneously. But the moment, and I mean the instant, you look at it, the moment you set up an experiment to measure where that electron is, the wave function collapses. The ghost becomes solid. The electron is suddenly in one place. Definite. Real. And this isn't a metaphor. This isn't some philosophical hand waving. This is what the math says. This is what experiments confirm. So the question is, what counts as observing? Does a conscious observer have to be involved? Can a detector do it? Can a photon count? Or does the universe really need a thinking mind to snap reality into place? This guy, John Wheeler, brilliant physicist, worked on the atom bomb, thought about the deepest questions. He got frustrated with this problem in the 1980s. He came up with something called the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment. And it's exactly as weird as it sounds. Here's the setup. You send a photon, a particle of light, toward a barrier with two slits. On the other side, you have detectors. Now, you can choose to set up your detectors in a way that measures which slit did the photon go through. Or you can set them up to measure wave-like behavior, no slits observed. The bizarre part? You can decide which setup you're going to use. After, the photon has already passed through the slits. But the photon's behavior changes based on your choice. The photon retroactively adjusts its behavior based on which question you're about to ask. Wheeler called this a participatory universe. The idea is that the observer doesn't passively receive reality. The observer is actively creating it. The universe is waiting for us to look, to measure, to ask questions, and only then does it crystallize into something definite. Wheeler thought this was profound. And honestly, I think he was on to something absolutely terrifying and beautiful. Okay, here's where I'm going to make a leap that your skeptical brain is already bristling at. Think about how modern video games work. When you're playing, say, a massive open world game, the system doesn't render everything. That would be computationally insane. Instead, it renders what's in front of you, the player's view. Everything outside your field of view, it's either low resolution or it's just not there. It's waiting to be rendered until you look at it. You turn a corner, the game loads the new geometry. You climb a hill and look out over a landscape, the distant trees pop in. You swing your camera around fast enough, and sometimes you'll catch the rendering happening in real time. You'll see the world being drawn into existence milliseconds after you looked in that direction. What if that's exactly what quantum mechanics is telling us about reality? What if the universe doesn't maintain a full, high-resolution simulation of everything at all times? What if it runs lean, only rendering what's being observed, and leaves everything else in a state of superposition, a probabilistic waiting room where anything could happen until someone looks? I'm not saying consciousness is literally magic, but I'm saying the math of quantum mechanics, the actual experimental data, looks suspiciously like a rendering engine optimizing for a conscious observer. Okay, I can hear the objection already. Travis, a photon isn't conscious. A camera detector isn't conscious. So if the universe collapses into reality based on measurement, and any measuring device works, then consciousness has nothing to do with it. That's fair. That's smart. That's what a lot of physicists will tell you. But here's the problem with that answer. Where do you draw the line between a measurement and just an interaction? If a particle hits another particle and you don't observe the result, is that a measurement? Does the wave function collapse? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen interpretation, for example, say yes, any observation counts. But others, like the many worlds interpretation, say no, nothing ever collapses. Every possible outcome happens in a different branch of reality. And then there's this fringe idea, and I'm genuinely not sure if it's genius or insane, that consciousness is special. That a conscious observer can collapse a wave function in a way that unconscious systems can't. That there's something about awareness, about a mind processing information, that actually changes the rules. It's unpopular. Most physicists will look at you like you're crazy if you suggest it, but it's not experimentally falsified. It's just unpopular. And sometimes unpopular is another word for we haven't figured out how to test it yet. Let me bring this back to you, to me, to what's actually happening right now. You're listening to this, and your brain is processing these words. You're imagining quantum mechanics. You're thinking about photons and wave functions and video game rendering. Your consciousness is focused, paying attention, doing what it does. If any of this is true, if observation, if consciousness, if the act of paying attention actually plays a role in collapsing the wave function of reality, then you're doing something profound right now. You're not just passively receiving reality, you're actively participating in its creation. Every time you focus on something, you're rendering it into existence. Every time you ignore something, you're letting it stay in the soup of probability. Every time you choose to be aware, you're making a real, actual difference to the structure of the universe. And that's not metaphorically true. If Wheeler was right, if the quantum mechanics is telling us something real about how reality works, then paying attention is work. Consciousness is labor. Witnessing is a force. You're not just here for the ride, you're here to observe. You're part of the rendering engine. I want to push this a step further, and I want to be honest that I'm getting into territory that might not be scientific fact anymore. This is more philosophical speculation. But bear with me. If reality does need observation to be real, if the universe is genuinely participatory, then here's a weird consequence. The parts of the universe you're not paying attention to are less real than the parts you are. Think about this. Right now, your consciousness is focused on my voice, on these ideas. The room around you is there, but it's peripheral. The world outside your window is less vivid. The other side of the planet, the bottom of the ocean, the inside of a star, you're not observing those. So, in some sense, they're less rendered. They're in superposition. They're waiting. This is what I mean by lighthouse. Your consciousness is like a lighthouse beam sweeping across the ocean. Where the light touches, there's detail, clarity, definition. Behind the beam, in the darkness, things are vaguer, less committed to a single state. And if that sounds like solipsism, the idea that only your mind is real, yeah, it kind of does. But there's a difference. If everyone is a lighthouse, if all conscious observers are rendering reality into being, then the universe is a participatory collaboration. You're observing it, but you're also being observed by everything else that's conscious. You're not the only one doing the rendering, but you're definitely doing some of it. Remember back in episode 9, we talked about the consciousness incubator hypothesis? The idea that this reality, this simulation might exist to create consciousness? What we're talking about now is the mechanism. If consciousness can collapse wave functions, if observation can render reality, then consciousness isn't just a byproduct of the simulation. Consciousness is the simulation's runtime. It's what makes the thing actually work. You're not just an observer in a predetermined universe. You're an essential part of the universe's operation. The simulation needs you to be aware. Your attention is substrate. Your consciousness is computation. That's why the simulation invested so much in making consciousness possible. That's why it created brains, nervous systems, the capacity for awareness. Not to torture you with existential dread, though fair, that's a side effect, but because consciousness is the thing that makes reality tick. You're not a passenger. You're a component. This is the thing that keeps me up at night. If observation is what renders reality, what happens to the parts of the universe you're not observing? Are they still there? Are they real? And here's the uncomfortable part. What about consciousness? What about you when you're not aware? When you're in deep sleep, when you're in a coma, when you're dead? If you're the observer and the observer is what makes things real, then what's the status of reality when you're not observing? Some physicists would say, well, other observers are still observing. The universe doesn't need you to observe it. It needs some observer, so it's fine. but that doesn't fully solve the problem, because it implies that reality is fundamentally dependent on consciousness. That without any observers in the universe would just exist in superposition, unresolved, undefined. That's not nothing. That's actually a pretty radical statement about the nature of existence. So here's what I want you to take away from this episode, this weird idea we've been playing with. Reality might not be a fixed, objective thing that exists independent of observation. It might be a participatory universe, a collaboration between all the conscious observers in it, including you. Your attention is real. Your awareness is real. The act of paying attention is doing something to the fabric of the universe. You're not just living in reality, you're making it. With every moment you choose to be aware, to notice, to observe, you're rendering the world into existence. And that means your consciousness isn't a cosmological accident, it's a cosmic necessity. Next episode, we're asking a different question. We've been talking about how reality works when it's observed, but what about when it's not? What happens in the darkness? What about the parts of your mind you don't observe? Your dreams, your subconscious, the thoughts you have when no one's watching, including yourself? Is there a simulation running underneath your conscious mind? Is your subconscious a rendering engine of its own? And what if dreams aren't just noise? What if they're the training data? What if every night when you sleep, the simulation is learning from your dreams, updating itself, getting better at predicting what you want, what you fear, what you'll choose to observe next? Join me next time on the Existence Experiment for Episode 11, The Dream Engine. I'm your host, Travis R. Barlow. This has been the Existence Experiment.